Okay. Why am I talking to you? So my name is Blair Scorgie. I'm a registered professional planner, urban designer. I have a Master's of Architecture from McGill specializing in urban design, and I've got a Bachelor of Urban and Regional Planning from Toronto Metropolitan, also sort of concentrating in urban design. I've got 15 years of consulting experience where I've worked for a few different companies. I've also got about 10 years of academic experience teaching at TMU and York University. I'm an advocate for what I feel is the need for policy and regulatory reform regarding housing, specifically at the scale that we're talking about today, as well as ensuring alignment between land use planning policy, if we can call it that, financial viability, and environmental sustainability. I'm also talking to you today because a lot of my work has sort of existed in this space. I've admittedly, up until fairly recently, a lot of my work has actually been with municipal governments, writing the policies, writing the regulations, and many, many sets of urban design guidelines to facilitate the development of laneway housing, garden suites, multiplexes, low-rise apartment buildings in cities kind of across the country, the prairies. I've worked in the Arctic, if you can imagine that. I've done some work in the GTA. I also helped write the book on how Missing Middle will help solve Toronto's housing affordability crisis by Coach House Books. It's called House Divided. And a lot of my sort of personal advocacy work is sort of centered in this space. So what is a multiplex? Okay. So before we get into the regulations themselves, and I think most of us already know the answers to some of these things, but I'm just going to provide you a very high-level overview of what we're talking about. So it's a residential building in the context of Toronto, and the way that Toronto's zoning bylaw defines it. It's a residential building that contains either 2, 3, or 4 self-contained units, partially or entirely above one another. So importantly, and that's an important point, because if they're not partially or entirely above one another, the City of Toronto actually defines them as a semi-detached dwelling, a row house, or a townhouse. So if you want to classify something in the zoning bylaw as a multiplex, that's what it has to do. They typically incorporate independent apartments and contain separate units or suites, and oftentimes, but I don't think they have to exclusively incorporate individual entrances. Certainly work I've done on the prairies is involved, in different contexts has involved, shared communal entrances, internal foyers. But in Toronto, largely we're looking at separate entrances and certainly separate utilities. They can also vary in size, design, and configuration, and you'll see many examples today, I'm sure of that. So they can technically be constructed either as purpose-built rental, which is probably quite a bit easier, or as condominium, which we're actually starting to see. There's a couple of recent examples, one notable one in, I believe, East York that's been gaining some attention recently. I say that because the Condo Act in Ontario isn't really designed around this scale of development. And they can be achieved through conversion, and by that I mean renovations, adaptive reuse, and repurposing of buildings that were previously intended for single families. Or single units, I should say, or they can be constructed for that intent specifically. They're a longtime staple of the housing mix in Toronto, but we've kind of regulated them out of existence. In the 1940s, 1950s, with the introduction of the city's zoning bylaw, and as a result, they up until recently, they only really tended to exist in certain areas of the city, basically that predated zoning, or where that sort of became part of the character of the neighborhood and was sort of embraced into zoning. So what are the benefits of a multiplex? There are many, and I think we're going to talk about a lot of them today. One of them is that they can help reestablish historic neighborhood populations. So in Toronto and in many other urban centers across the country, our inner city neighborhoods have like seriously hollowed out quite significantly. Toronto, there's a stat I saw at one point, Toronto has grown by over 500,000 people in the last 20-something years, and over that same time frame, its neighborhoods have hollowed out by a factor of like 200,000 people. And a lot of that is in the inner city neighborhoods, which are most highly desirable, and demographic patterns are changing, and that kind of stuff is happening, right? They can also, in doing so, they can help us make better use of existing infrastructure, services, and amenities, right? Like the roads, the sewers, etc. They offer a range of housing types that are needed and sought in locations that are highly desirable, as I mentioned. They cater to a range of lifestyles and life cycle stages. They can be constructed relatively quickly, I mean, compared to some of the alternatives that we're talking about, environmentally sustainably, and relatively speaking, inexpensively. So basically, I'm going to talk to you about something that's called the Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods Initiative, and it's an umbrella initiative that the City of Toronto is leading, and it's important because it sort of sets the stage for the policies and the regulations specific to multiplexes. So it's comprised of a series of independent but interrelated studies that are all sort of focusing on expanding housing options in neighborhoods, you know, as the name sort of indicates. By doing so, its aim is ultimately to address Toronto's housing needs by focusing primarily on low-rise housing in residential areas and creating new solutions for them. So, you know, and by that I'm talking about like garden suites, laneway suites, multiplexes, low-rise apartment buildings, etc. It's also, there's a separate study that's looking at expanding the potential viability of and permissions for non-residential uses to sort of support the idea of creating complete communities. And so one of those studies was called the Multiplex study. There's the Major Street study, which you're probably hearing about now. There's the Multiplex study. There's this non-res study. There's a few other things. So the policies and regulations that govern multiplexes came out of the Multiplex study, unsurprisingly. And while the EHON initiative remains ongoing, the Multiplex study actually kind of wrapped up in 2023. So in its specific focus is permitting multiplexes across the City of Toronto, with the intent of supporting a more equitable approach to city building. And its ultimate sort of, the outcome of all of that work was a staff report to council that was approved, and along with, you know, what was at the time draft official plan and zoning bylaw regulations to amend policies to actually sort of permit these things. So now I'm going to quickly go through what's contained in the official plan amendment. So the official plan amendment for multiplexes was brought into effect in June of 2023, and its intent ultimately is just to clarify permissions and set out development criteria to direct the development of multiplexes across all lands that have the neighborhood land use designation in the City of Toronto. So there are a number of land use maps in the City of Toronto official plan. The City of Toronto has kindly sort of merged them all together and color-coded everything yellow here in this map, just for ease of reference. So these are all the lands in the City of Toronto that are designated neighborhood, and they are now also all the lands where multiplexes are permitted as of right. And this is just as of last year. Okay? So this is pretty recent. This is the other reason I'm speaking with you about this is when we had this conference last year, these rules weren't in place, right? So this is new. And yeah, so it's pretty exciting. And it's structured as this is getting a bit nuanced and perhaps a bit detailed, but it's structured as a site and area specific policy and there are many in the City of Toronto that are contained in Chapter 7 of the official plan if you want to look them up. There's hundreds of them. And many of them apply to specific locations, sites even, or clusters of sites, or types of sites. This particular site and area specific policy applies to all lands designated neighborhood across the City of Toronto. And then the zoning bylaw, which I know is fun and exciting and everybody's probably read as, you know, their light bedtime reading. So it was brought into effect around the same time in May of 2023 with the express purpose of permitting duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes within all residential zones across the City of Toronto. So this is a tool to implement the policy directions of the official plan. So where the official plan says we're going to permit multiplexes as of right on a citywide basis, the zoning bylaw is creating regulations to permit them on you know, individual properties throughout the City of Toronto that fall within that land use designation. So in doing so, the new zoning bylaw permits multiplexes in approximately the same envelope that you would expect to see in a detached or semi-detached dwelling. So there was really this effort to harmonize regulations between different building typologies. So because the whole idea is that a multiplex fits into the, you know, the character of a neighborhood fairly harmoniously and can coexist harmoniously with other residential uses, right? So similar building envelope with a few sort of notable adjustments, and I'm gonna spend just a couple of minutes speaking to those. And this is a minor thing, but one of the things right off the bat is just this intent to sort of harmonize setback conditions, and so the side yard setbacks. So basically, there are a couple of adjustments required in a couple of the zones, the R and the RM zones, just to ensure that the regulations were harmonized. That's a pretty minor detail. Permitting up to 2 porches, decks, and balconies per unit. So this is an interesting one because, according to the new regulations, each individual unit in a multiplex can incorporate up to 2 platforms, and these can include decks, balconies, and they have to occur basically at or above the second story. They can be located in the front or the rear wall of the building, or the side wall if it faces, a corner condition, a flanking street frontage. There's no maximum size for these platforms specifically laid out in this regulation, but they do have to conform with other performance standards and regulations in the zoning bylaw. The next sort of adjustment is building depth. So, so basically, building depths are permitted up to 17 meters. So there were previously some changes. Certain building types were permitted certain depths, others different depths, and there were some earlier on, before the regulations came into effect, there's some conversation about maybe changing some of the regulations around the depths of multiplexes. In the effort of sort of simplification, harmonization, it was decided that for all sort of standard sized lots across all residential zones, 17 meters would be permitted for multiplexes, as is the case for detached and semi-detached dwellings. There are a couple of exceptions to that, and those are sites that are classified as deep lots. And so deep lots are, for properties that have frontages that are less than 10 meters, have to have a depth of at least 36 meters. And if the property has a depth that's at least or greater than 10 meters, they need to have a depth of 40 meters. And if they achieve those criteria, then a multiplex can have a depth of 19 meters instead of 17 meters. Another sort of key adjustment has to do with building height. So the map on the right-hand side sort of illustrates areas of the city that were previous to this regulation that permitted building heights of 10 meters or greater in blue, and in sort of the pink color, I guess, that had regulations applying to building heights that were less than 10 meters as a maximum regulation. So what the city did in introducing the zoning regulations for multiplexes is they said, in the blue areas, basically, where buildings are already permitted to be 10 meters and above, those regulations continue to apply. But in all the areas in pink, say the maximum height is 8.5 meters or 9 meters, an exception was created to ensure that multiplexes could be a height of 10 meters in all those zones. And that's important just to ensure the viability of a full third story, which of course is critical if you're trying to build a triplex or a fourplex. The next adjustment has to do with, this is getting into the details, but the main wall height permissions, and basically the long and short of it here, and I'll be brief on this, but there are some regulations around maximum street wall height and the requirement for a step back of 1.4 meters above that height, and those have been applied now to multiplexes as well. I don't think we need to get into a ton of detail about that. Oh, sorry, I missed a couple things. But there are some other things in here, and I guess I must have skipped over them. But multiplexes are also notably not subject to maximum floor space index regulations, so that's really important because it sort of treats it like a form-based code. So FSI is kind of, in my humble opinion, a bit of a useless regulation, because if you have all these other performance standards like height, setbacks, lot coverage, soft landscaping, etc., you don't really. It's just like adding an unnecessary layer of regulation. So for multiplexes, multiplexes have been given an exception to that regulation, and they no longer have to. They don't have to conform to that. So you can sort of kindly ignore the FSI regulations when you're building a multiplex. You can also have multiple building entrances with a multiplex, and there's a few other minor things, but those are kind of the key highlights. What else should you know? So if you're submitting an application for a multiplex and it doesn't completely align or conform with the new multiplex regulations. That's not to say you can't build it. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, but there's a process. You can submit a minor variance application, present to the Committee of Adjustment, and if it meets the if the application meets the 4 tests of a minor variance, then and depending on the mood of the members of the Committee of Adjustment that day, and maybe whether or not they've had their coffee, you might walk away with an approval. So you might expect that you could potentially get away with minor variances pertaining to height, setbacks, lot coverage, building depth, maybe even the number of units as well. So where the baseline used to be kind of lower, now the baseline is 4 units, and we're starting to see variances where people are asking for 5 or 6. So that's something to keep in mind too. If you're submitting an application for a multiplex, and there are 4 or fewer units in it, it's actually also exempt from development charges. So this is interesting because on certain sites, as of right, you can technically build a 4-plex plus either a garden suite or a laneway suite. Doing so would trigger development charges, but if you leave it just to the 4-plex, you don't pay development charges or cash in lieu payments for parkland dedication. So that's maybe something to be aware of. Who's going to build and occupy these things? Okay, sorry. Time check. I better wrap this up. So small-scale builders, sophisticated builders that want to get into the sort of a new housing market. I think it also opens the door for citizen developers who own land and want to do something with it. As I said, I think it will attract a broad range of people who want to live in them, representing different sort of family structures, life cycle stages, life cycles. I think they serve as an interesting opportunity for young people to sort of break into the housing market, and they also, on the other end of the spectrum, serve as an interesting opportunity for people that are empty nesters to remain in place and find suitable accommodations in their neighborhood that don't currently exist. They could even be opportunities for people to sort of help finance their own retirement if they convert their single detached dwelling into multiple units and rent them out and live in one of them. So just very quickly, I'll be very quick, I promise. Some examples of multiplexes that are recent. So this is one in East York. It's actually 2 properties side by side, 4 plexes in each of them, plus a laneway suite in the back. So a total of 10 units on these sites that previously occupied 1 single unit. Some variances were required, but the process was made much easier by virtue of the fact that we now have these regulations in place. This next one is a triplex in Midtown. So where the previous slide contemplated a new build, this is a renovation and addition. The property owner has a 2-story unit, and then they have 2 additional rental units on site. This is a new construction in Harvard Village. It's a 4-plex plus a laneway suite designed by LGA. And finally, this is a triplex in North York that, again, was an adaptive reuse and renovation of an existing single-unit dwelling that required some variances and happened prior to the regulations coming into effect. If the representatives from Eurodale Designer and Builder are here today, they'll probably tell you how complicated this was to get approved at the time, and this is exactly the type of thing that would be permitted as of right today. So with that, I'll thank you for your time. If you'd like to get in touch with me, that's my email address right there. My name is Blair Scorgie. I'm easy to find. I'm the only one on the internet. Take care. Thanks.